Are we all settled? I think we're running a little behind, but you know it's been a long day, and thank you so much for staying until the last panel for the day. And I know we have different choices. It's been an amazing summit for this past 2 days. I'm Vina Lanzona. I'm an associate professor in history in the UHM, Department of History here at UHM. So I'm also one of the co-conveners of the 1898 summit. So we're really very pleased that it seemed like it's been such an successful and amazing event. I didn't really expect this many people from many different places all over Hawaii and the world, I think. So, so thank you again for coming to this last panel. So when we were organizing this conference, I told Craig that we need to have a panel on women because I actually didn't have to justify it because it's very clear that of course we need to have a panel on women. And I said we wanted to at first do a kind of back-to-back, women in history, and trying to connect all our the experiences of women in all our different regions, right? I'm also a historian of the Philippines and Southeast Asia, so my work has been on women and gender and the revolution during the Japanese occupation and after. So, and then I said going from, the first on history and then to the contemporary period, because women have always been at the forefront of struggle and resistance here in Hawaii, right? So I'm so glad that you're all here, and I'm also very glad that not just women are in our audience. So thank you for coming. So I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers, and so we can just go right into our panel. I think the way that we're going to organize our panel is for each of our speakers to talk about their own work, because they're all scholars and activists who have very familiar with or about women in terms of organizing, resistance, and their place in history. So it deals with the specifics of women's participation, organizing, and leadership for all movements in different historical periods and also different regions. So our first speaker will be Dr. Noelani Goodyear Kaʻōpua, who the first time I met you, I think, in person, but I've always known about your work. She believes in the power of Ea, the living, breathing, rising of her sovereign people, because she hears and feels it in their stories. She works as a professor of Hawaiian indigenous politics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm very excited because she's working on the biography of Haunani K. Trask, and I really hope that she'll be able to share her work with us today. And our second speaker is a Chamorro, of course. No need to say that you're Kanakamoli, but yeah, Kanakamoli. But Chamorro of Guåhan, Dr. Mary Therese Hattori is Director of the Pacific Islands Development Program at East West Center, affiliate graduate faculty at UHM and Chaminade University, a community organizer, scholar, mentor, poet, tech geek, and philanthropist. But obviously, she's also one of the main female activists in Guåhan, and so she has both her two homes in Hawaii and Guåhan. So welcome, Mary. And finally, born and raised on Oahu, Sam Ikehara strives to build and uplift international networks of solidarity against militarism across Asia and the Pacific Islands through her research and activism. Right now, she is you have a postdoc fellowship at University of California, Santa Cruz, and she was born and raised here in Hawaii and went to finish her graduate degree also in USSC, right? Santa Cruz. Oh no.
Yeah, USC, but
USC, okay. And she's now on a postdoc, and she's here with us right now. So I'll start with Noelani. Welcome. Thank you.
Mai kumuhonua I luna e kalabalani mai pahikina asi komohana mai kahoʻopui kahalawai e hina ki aloha kākou.
Aloha.
Oh, yeah, this is a panel about wahine. Why Why aren't we in Haumea?
I know. Exactly. Yes. I know. We should, exactly. I know. Because it's Craig, no. Craig has been wonderful, but yeah, I'll tell him about that next time. Yeah. Exactly.
I'm sorry. Just teasing. I love Craig. It is so awesome to be here. This is like a home for me, even though this particular building wasn't here when I was an undergrad in Hawaiian Studies. I was came out of this intellectual home of Hawaiian Studies, and in this building, after I graduated though, there are two people who are really important in changing the course of my life that I got to meet through the kumu who were leading this place. The first was Kumu Haunani Trask invited Angela Davis, who did speak in Haumea and met with undergrad students and was at UC Santa Cruz. And I said, I want to go somewhere where I can learn from this person. And so I got to learn from her and Nefertiti Tadiar as well, who were just amazing. And then the other people who I met here in Haumea were Kuen Nale Kahakalau, who the year after I came back from grad school were talking about this visions of starting schools and believed in young people's ability to actually start schools, even though we knew nothing about it. So really grateful that Kamakakuokalani has for a long time been a place for holding these kinds of conversations.
Thank you.
So yes, I'm working on, with Kahuna by Right, a biography of our kumu, Haunani K. Trask, and I'm going to share just a very small glimpse of that in connection to the theme of 1898, because one of the things that I've been thinking about is, that we've been thinking about, is that she writes her famous book From a Native Daughter. So it's not from a Native woman, it's from a Native daughter. So immediately she situates herself as part of this genealogical continuum. And so the genealogy that I want to call forward today is about the continuity about our Wahine Aloha Aina that has existed prior to 1898 and forward. And so as I share that, it's really special for me to have my two daughters in the room here.
Oh.
On the spot.
I have to just shout out to them, especially because their dad is also on a panel in another room, and I'm so glad they chose to come to me. So Haunani Trask's most well-known book, From a Native Daughter, was titled after an essay of the same name. It was an essay that was first published in a 1987 anthology called The American Indian and the Problem of History, and it appeared alongside the works of giants like Vine Deloria, N. Scott Momaday, Gerald Vizenor, and Henrietta Whiteman. Trask was the only contributor of Kamoana Nui to that anthology, and in this piece she recounts this argument she had on a panel about the 1893 overthrow, in which white academic detractors were saying that our mele and our family stories were not legitimate forms of evidence that Kanaka Maoli resisted the illegal usurpation of the Hawaiian Kingdom government. So she writes in that piece, quote, "My tutu had told my mother, who had told me, that at the time of the overthrow, a great wailing went up throughout the islands, a wailing of weeks, a wailing of impenetrable grief, a wailing of death." And this is where my story begins today. Iwalani Haya was 14 years old at the time of the Great Wailing. The eldest child of two Hawaiian community leaders, she followed the news of Queen Liliuokalani facing Haole insurrectionists who hurled lies about the queen and claimed that men of their race were more capable of ruling Hawaii. Of course, we know that alone such aspersions would have meant little, but the conspirators were backed by the US Marines. So Iwalani grew into adulthood in the ensuing chaos, political chaos, when those traitors imprisoned Liliuokalani in her own palace. Iwalani gave birth to her first child the same year the U.S. planted a colonial government in the islands. A few years later, she buried her second daughter, who was just a toddler when life slipped away. Iwalani conceived and carried 6 more children, and then in 1916, death claimed her mama, her beloved mama, Fanny Wilmington, the matriarch, who in 1897 had taken all of her daughters to sign the anti-annexation petitions that we now call the Ku'e petitions in Hana at Vananalua Church. After Iwalani's mama died, Iwalani was heavy into her 9th pregnancy, and she awoke one morning to a messenger bringing word that her husband's bloody body had just been found shot in the back on his 43rd birthday. Here was a woman who knew the meaning of impenetrable grief. Yet Iwalani learned to rise again. She named that youngest child that she was carrying when her husband was murdered after her closest sister and for the mountain that gave them strength, Kahaunani o Haleakala. They called the little girl Haunani. And from her first breath, Haunani Cooper knew only life under the malu of a single mother and Maui's great house of the sun. Mama Iwa could weave lauhala, she could sew, she could sing hymns, she could chant, she could read in Hawaiian and English languages, but she spoke to the kids only in their mother tongue, even though their Irish Catholic father spoke to them in English. Ancestral confidence ran like a firm current through her. Iwalani farmed kalo and directed the movements of fishers. She taught her children how to plant and fish by the moon's phases. In September 1923, the sun arced overhead toward Haleakala as Iwalani and other women of Hana stood on the pier at Hana Bay. With eager anticipation, they awaited a delegation of prominent wahine aloha aina coming from various islands across the archipelago. 30 years earlier, many of these wahine had been movers and shakers in those petition drives supporting the Queen. But by 1923, Lili'u had been deceased for years, and a first generation of children was already growing up under the U.S. occupation. World War I and the global pandemic that the war exacerbated took further tolls on the Lahui, Hawaiʻi. And Kanaka were dealing with the trauma of rule by a hyper-patriarchal white supremacist minority oligarchy. So how could these wahine aloha aina ensure that their collective bonds as a distinct people would endure, that their grandchildren would recognize them as Hawaiians, themselves as Hawaiians? Resuscitating the Ahahui Ka'ahumanu, also known as the Ka'ahumanu Society, was one strategy that these women used to honor their historical political leaders with a degree of secrecy at that time. And through the Ahahui, they supported one another socially, emotionally, spiritually, and even financially at times. So the Hana organizers greeted their esteemed visitors one by one as these women crossed the gangplank at the bay. And foremost among the Ahahui leaders were Lucy Kahehe Malie Kaʻōpua Peabody and Lahilahi Webb, president or Peresidena Nui and Kakao Olelo of the society, respectively. In the 1800s, Peabody and Webb were supported the premier ali'i as chiefly attendants of the highest level and as influential wahine in their own right. Peabody served as kahu and confidant to Queen Emma, Kaleleo Nalani, supporting Emma in the contentious 1874 election versus Kalakaua. And Webb, who was roughly 20 years Peabody's junior, served Kamo'i Lili'uokalani. Both had been members of the Hui Aloha Aina o Nā Wahine that supported Lili'u. And so it was no surprise that Webb became Kakao Olelo of the Ahahui because she was also a scholar of Hawaiian history. After these leaders rechartered the Ahahui in 1905, they began to seed new chapters through the Pai'aina. And then in her 1940s, Iwalani Haya Cooper Hana took them to various places, and then on the final day, they gathered before sunrise at the base of Kaʻōpua for a final ceremony. The hui slowly but steadily climbed to the top of the pu'u, going no faster than the slowest person, and the oldest member of their hui was 83 at the time. Upon reaching the top, they stood there, they first looked seaward, eastward, toward the deep ocean and the islet of Mokuhano, then northward, and this is all in Lahilahi Webb's description. Then they looked northward toward Pueokahi and the cave where Ka'ahumanu herself was cared for amid warfare, was born and cared for amid warfare. Then they looked westward, Ikehara, Ikealoha, and finally toward the mountain Haleakala, A'ike ia Kanani, Amekalaula, O'uaina, Ualani Ha'aha'a. This ritual consecrated the Ka'ahumanu Society's Hana chapter, and by encircling herself with women of the Ahahui, Iwalani learned how to carry her impenetrable grief. Kaʻōpua then held Iwalani steady for the rest of her years. Over time, as her long hair turned from black to silver, she often stood alongside the hill like an old friend. From that vantage point, she observed the movements of the fish, winds, currents, birds, and celestial bodies. Reading the Aina and Kai, she watched schools of fish and methodically directed the fishers below with her gestures. After they would bring the catch to shore, all of them took their shares for their families, and in this way, while sugar planters and American imperialists undermined Hawaiian self-government, Iwalani continued to act as a konohiki, a kilo, a leader whose embodied knowledge of Aina fed her people. And this was a story that her children then passed on to their children. And, gosh, where should I end this? I think what I'll just end by saying is that I'm not sure how much Haunani-Kea knew this particular level of detail about the gathering that supported her kupuna, her tutu. She did talk about how her tutu had signed the ku'e petitions. And whether she knew the details of the mo'olelo or not, I think it really speaks to the kind of strength of women organizing and gathering that was then passed on to her mama, who was the first generation to live her entire life under U.S. occupation in their family, such that by the time Haunani-Kea goes through her education and emerges as a leader, she always knew and held that understanding that, as she said in 1982 at the Iolani Palace bandstand, we are the alternative. We are the alternative to Waikiki. She said, we are the alternative to Kavakiu. We are the alternative to an extractive and violent way of valuing land in Hawaii that she absolutely knew. The way, as she said, women have not lost sight of Malahui. And that knowledge continued to be carried on. Where I'll start right now. Wow.
Thank you. Mahalo. Thank you. As you're speaking, I kept thinking that our future is in our past. And what I want to share is really comes from my past as a Chamorro woman. But it's very similar, drawing on the power of women from the past. We forget that. Every day in this country, in America, women's rights are eroding. I'm afraid that everything American is going to become normative in Hawaii and the Pacific, the way it always does. We need to look to our Pacific peoples. I am from the island of Guam. I'm just going to give you a little background. Many of you already know this, but some of you don't. We're part of a chain of islands known as the Marianas in the Western Pacific, 3,957 miles away. We have a long history of foreign domination, beginning with Ferdinand Magellan's landing in 1521. We were a colony of Spain until 1898, then a possession of the United States, occupied by the Japanese quite violently on December 8, 1941, recaptured in 1944 by the United States.
The Organic Act of 1950 established us as a territory of the United States. But before this, our people had been there for millennia. There's a beautiful website, Micronesia Milestones. It's a visual timeline of history. And my ancestors were settling the Marianas at the same time the Sphinx, the Great Sphinx, was being built. Right? Our people had been there for millennia. We enjoyed a society that was matrilineal and matriarchal. The objectification, exotification, sexualization, and subjugation of women did not occur until the arrival of Spanish missionaries, Japanese invaders, and American colonizers. Again, in the Pacific, traditional indigenous ideals of female beauty have been marred by distorted Western representations and misogynistic norms. I think enough is enough. I said that yesterday in reference to some other norms that we seem to tolerate a lot in Hawaii. And I think we should look at look at Hawaiian culture, right? This history of the power of women in Chamorro. We actually have a phrase for this. Famalawan is women, Fuetsan is power. And so the phrase we use is Fuetsan Famalawan. I grew up in a culture steeped in Fuetsan Famalawan. We didn't disrespect men. We had equal, different realms of authority and power. I did not know racism or sexism, did not experience sexism until I came to Hawaii. My first long-term job, 12 years as the director of technology at Kapiolani Community College. At our height of enrollment, we had 9,000 students, 200 faculty and staff. The only female director of technology in all of the 10 campuses at the University of Hawaii. I didn't understand that I was coming to the United States and moving into a field where women were underrepresented. I didn't understand because in Guam, you can pursue anything you want to pursue. We taught computer science in my class, and I graduated in the early 80s. So it wasn't moving into, this notion of male-dominated fields was quite foreign to me. I work as director of the Pacific Islands Development Program, and we are working on the renewed Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration, connected to the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific Continent. This is the guiding document for Pacific Islanders, for all of the Pacific, and for those Pacific Islanders like Chamorro, Hawaiians, American Samoans, people in the CNMI who are part of the United States and not politically part of the drafting of things like the 2050 strategy and the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration. I say there are many that still should be, those documents should be documents that we embrace, that we engage with. There are opportunities for us to engage with these documents and the fora as members of civil society, and that we need to reclaim our place as Pacific women. We need to reclaim our place as Pacific peoples. We are American by citizenship only. We have to remember that and contain that. And we have to look back on and continue to have gatherings like this where we bring forward the stories of our history. And for our wonderful allies in the audience who are American or come from Western societies that are male-dominated, where you don't have these norms, I have empathy for you and invite you to learn more from us. There's always the assumption that we need to learn from you. This is one area where you, American society, can benefit greatly by learning from Pacific Islander norms around women. So I invite you to do that, and I'm going to end with a poem. This was published in Yellow Medicine Review, and I've shared this with in other fora. I shared this with grad students in the East-West Center where I work, and was quite struck by a couple of women who came up to me later crying, saying they were American from the continent, and they were crying because they regret growing up in a society where they never experienced the power of women. And they wanted their nieces, their daughters, to experience this. And I hope that someday we can actually realize that for the United States. And invite you all to think about that and how we can do that, because your rights as women are in great danger. We all know that, but what are we doing about it? I don't think we're doing enough. And look to your Pacific Islander sisters, because we've been doing this for millennia. Fuetsan Famalawan, an anthem to women. With my breath I speak, I sing, I chant, with breath that vibrates from powerful and ancient sounds, Fino Inalatlata, words of our life, the language of my people. In my breath is the collective power of Chamorro women, Fuetsan Famalawan, from our first creator woman, Fu'una, of Antes na Tiempo, the time before time, from our Magahaga, women of power, to generations of Manaina, wise elders. My breath is my ink, with which I craft words. Words of recognition, words that heal, words that light the path for others, that clear the path for others, words that create futures. I am life, Linatla, I am strength, Minatgut, I am love, Guinaiza.
Aloha mai kako. My name is Sam Ikehara. It's such an honor to be on this panel. I had such a sparse bio that because I feel like I'm kind of here in my capacity today, not really as an academic, even though that's what I am, but more as a member of Women's Voices, Women Speak, and a board member of Hawaiʻi Peace and Justice. And because I was invited to speak on this panel, because I was part of a Women's Voices Women Speak delegation to Olongapo, to Subic Bay, and to Manila last year, as a part of a gathering for the International Women's Network Against Militarism. So my remarks will be more kind of oriented towards the legacies of 1898 that we all are confronting and thinking about today, and its impacts on activism. And I had the privilege on going on this huaka'i with so many amazing people. I wanted to, some of them are physically I was gonna say I wanna call them into the room, but they're physically in the room. So Kim's here, Kaʻōpua is here, Ihila Sconia, Nikki Cristobal, Iris Miranda. I'm sitting here for some reason, but Kim and Hina, I invite you to just share from the huaka'i too if you feel called to, or yeah, please do. I also wanted to honor the women who formed Women's Voices, Women Speak. So Auntie Terry Kiko'olani, Ellen Ray Cachola, and Gigi Miranda. Also Joy's here. Joy's a member of Women's Voices, Women Speak too. And so I really think about the Hawaiʻi chapter of the International Women's Network Against Militarism really emerging out of this kind of call to think about Hawaiʻi's connections to the Philippines, especially in 2004, the moment when this chapter formed, and how that has kind of evolved since then. In the program, next to my name, it says Hawaiʻi, the Pacific, and the Philippines, and I was like, what? And so I wanted to just share that as a settler to this Aina, I traced my own genealogy to Keen in Okinawa, to Yamaguchi in Japan, and to Guangzhou in China. So even though those are all listed next to my name on the conference panel, as if I'm some kind of expert who will speak on all of these places, I really consider myself more just like of a lifelong learner of what my kuleana is to these places and how to deepen it and fulfill it. So that's how I'm arriving at this panel. And so just as part of, before I kind of talk more about the specifics of the gathering in the Philippines, I did want to just say a little bit about the history of the network, because I think that really is only through kind of retracing the steps a little bit that their kinds of ways that they confront 1898 becomes more clear, I think. So in many ways, it emerges out of legacies of 1898, but also 1879. That was the year that Japan annexed the Ryukyu Kingdom, or what we now call today Okinawa. And it was it was Okinawan women's organizing against sexual crimes committed by the US military, the formation of Okinawan Women Act Against Military Violence that led to the creation of the International Women's Network. Okinawan women brought this to the US. They toured all over the US, and people in solidarity came together and formed this network. It was against this context of militarized sexual violence, but also against the US-Japan Security Treaty, that Okinawan women honed in on that word security and were like, this treaty does not keep us secure. And it's there that Suzuyo Takasato, one of the founders of, it's a long name, sorry, Okinawan Women Act Against Military Violence, came up with genuine security. And since then, the network has been organized around what is genuine security for us, and how is that something we create rather than something that is a treaty that is imposed upon us without our consent. And so it was in this context that the network grew across Asia. As so many of them have said, US soldiers, sexual crimes, they don't know any national boundaries. So one thing that they honed in on was, in Marine Station in Okinawa, for example, went to Subic Bay for war exercises. They raped a woman there, and then they went back to Okinawa. And so they're really thinking, in those early years, they were thinking about these connectivities between Okinawa, Korea, and the Philippines, and this kind of interconnected web of sexual violence they were all really entrenched in. But when Puerto Rican activists managed to kick the Navy out of Vieques, the women in the network were like, we want to talk to those women. Like, how did they do that? So they invited Puerto Rican women to Okinawa to have that conversation. And that was in 2000. 4 years later, Auntie Terry, Ellen, and Gigi, I'm not sure who else was on that huaka'i, but that would be the first year that Hawaiʻi participated too, to have this conversation about, islands and what is this kind of really our position in this larger network of power. And then when US Marines were being moved when it was announced that US Marines were being moved from Okinawa to Guåhan, that was when women from Guåhan were invited to kind of be a part of this conversation. I think Lisa Natividad was the first woman from Guåhan to participate in the network. And it was this deep recognition of the ties between all of these places. And I love this quote from Hananike Trask because I think it really elucidates the kind of ways that women in the network come to this conversation. It was the deep recognition of what Hananike Trask called, quote, the ultimate injury of becoming strategically important in the game of superpower politics, end quote. Thinking about that ultimate injury of being strategically important and all of the consequences that all these places live through every day because of that designation. And so some of the elders in the network love to tell this story, and I think it's so potent and powerful for today. But when the network traveled to Guåhan for the first time, I think in 2009, they gathered on a beach, and one of the first things they did was burn the Treaty of Paris. They wanted to repudiate, Spanish legacies, U.S. legacies of colonialism in Guåhan, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Hawaiʻi. And now today, the network encompasses women and non-binary people from so many different nations. And I think one thing that me, as someone who's newer to the network, has been really inspired by is the ways the network keeps growing, evolving, necessarily stretching itself to deal with not just the U.S. empire, but all of these multi-layered imperial legacies, Spain, the U.S., Japan, et cetera, how this forces and just like the day-to-day of how to communicate with one another, the language politics of that. So that's a little bit of context. I wanted to say a little bit more about the huaka'i to the Philippines last year. We all learned so much about the really rich and complicated struggle from 1989 to 1992 to not renew the military bases agreement with the U.S. We went on a tour of Olongapo, which was led by city officials actually, but we saw, abandoned ammunition depots. We saw signs about contaminated water. We saw factories of East Asian investors who are just zooming in there. And, so many efforts to bolster tourism and to make Olongapo a tourist destination. And with the Women of Buklo, the Women Empowerment Center, they guided us to the bars that so many of them used to work at, that many of them still do work at, where they do work to support the women who are still working in the bars, trying to equip them with education and opportunities to leave that kind of economy and to support them once they're outside of it. And the network met with Virgie Suarez too, who is one of the main lawyers who is on the lawsuit that was dealing with the murder of Jennifer Laude by a U.S. Marine, Joseph Pemberton, in 2014. And so during our time there, even though it's been 30 years, since 1992, 31 years, 32 years? It's been around 30 years. But we just saw all the ways, that these legacies of U.S. imperialism, all these different layers of colonialism and imperialism still completely structure life in Olongapo in all these devastating ways. And it gave me a lot to reflect on about, life in Hawaiʻi as we kind of think about 2029 military leases and not renewing those leases here, but how that would just be one beginning to a really long journey of, of so much stuff I can't even say here, remediation and so many other things. And so in January of this year, I felt like I was kind of revisiting all of these places because I was on Google Maps looking at Olongapo, clicking up and down the streets that we were traveling on because it was, I was doing this because Kim and I were invited to speak at a press conference that was addressing the moving of fuel from Red Hill from Oahu to Subic Bay. And so she and I were tracking the ships that carried the fuel. I was looking at all of these different fuel storage facilities in Olongapo, thinking like, where are they going to take it? Where will these ships enter port? But it was in an online meeting, just like a regular meeting of the International Women's Network, where we all gather on Zoom to just share country updates of what's happening where. That Cora Fabros, who's a longtime organizer in the Philippines, first learned about Red Hill and the fuel being moved there. And then that set off so much into motion because Cora is so well connected with demilitarization and activists in the Philippines. And that culminated in the U.S. canceling their entry into Subic Bay. But at the same time, that was earlier this year. There's still a lot we don't know about where the fuel's going, like what kind of things will happen with the fuel from Red Hill in Subic Bay. But being a part of the network I haven't been part of the network long, but just learning about its history, connecting with the women there, being a part of this trip made me realize, we don't know what the U.S. Navy will do moving forward, but moving forward, I just saw the incredible kind of strength of these connections just between people to people and how they can make big things like that happen. And how, we as just through these relations can continually confront these imperial legacies and write a kind of different story of relation for the future that's not just about 1898, but yeah.
Thank you.
So yes, thank you. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Sam. Well, I was part of this panel originally. I'm still part of the panel now, but and not just as a moderator, because I'm also supposed to talk about the Philippines and in terms of women Philippine history. But thank you for putting us, to the present and having all these things that are happening. But I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, women and women's roles in the contemporary historical period in the Philippines, right? We always think that, and it's such a paradox, like the Philippines, because on the one hand, we produced 2 female presidents, probably more than the U.S., right? We had 2, we have had 2 female presidents, but at the same time, there's still a lot of, as we said, a lot of challenges that women face in the Philippines. In fact, we have a very famous metaphor, which is a very gendered metaphor. I'm sure many of you have probably have heard that, the Filipinos are like that because we spent 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood, so it's like it's this kind of sort of a what do you call that, a schizophrenic, identity, because being in the convent means, like the whole influence of Catholicism, which is still so pervasive and so strong in the Philippines, and I'm sure in Guåhan too. And because of that, prior to colonialism, we pride ourselves as being part of this whole Southeast Asian Pacific region where women had more autonomy and women were priestesses, women had so much power, right? And then, we're not, and in fact, as Filipino women, we always thought, oh, we're Southeast Asian women, we're not the same as probably, we didn't have foot binding, we didn't have child marriage, infanticide and all that, which was, very common in East Asian, cultures, right? So, but of course with Catholicism came a lot of this kind of restrictions, in women. But throughout history, our women have always fought, so that was in terms of my work too. I looked at women, they were part of the revolution against the Spanish. And then after the Spanish, of course, during the American period, women also were at the forefront of all these battle struggles. And then, of course, as I said, in terms of my work, I work on women who were involved in World War II and in the communist rebellion that came after during the post-colonial period, right? So women were always at the forefront of struggle in the Philippines, and as you probably really saw that the women are, in your organization are out there. But at the same time, we have, the roles of women in the Philippines is as I said, is such a paradox, like we're the only country in the world outside of Vatican City with no divorce laws, right? So women are still in this very, traditional idea, or have this kind of traditional bondage of marriage, or at least this idea that you can't have a divorce. We don't have, human and sex trafficking is of course a major, major issue for women. We supply more than half of domestic servants, all over the world, in terms of that. We don't have, rights for LGBTQs, even though they're trying to force that we have the SOGI bill for equality, but until now the church is so powerful and the state would still say those things about, we'll never have, divorce in the Philippines, we'll never, homosexuality is a sin, and all that. And so there's all this kind of paradox. At the same time, you have these women at the forefront of every struggle. And as I said, we have two Philippine, Philippine presidents who are women, and they've impacted a lot in terms of their roles as presidents. Really transformed a lot of the roles of women, but still there's still a lot of struggles and of course imperialism and colonialism, all that. So I just wanted to kind of share that, because as somebody who also works in the Philippines. So, but I'd like to either we ask each other some questions, if you have any questions for each other, or if you wanted to open it up to the floor. If you guys have any questions, you can talk about women in history, or current struggles of women now. So, okay. If not, I can start, because we do have some questions. Do you guys have any questions? Okay. So I think we wanted to kind of talk about, for example, how would you differentiate a movement that was dominated by women, and how, because we were talking about how we need to build all this solidarity, right, with different groups, right, so but how would you characterize or differentiate, a movement or organization that's predominantly led by women versus one that's predominant? I mean, it's a very obvious question, but I wanted to ask your questions, like how can it make a difference, the fact that a movement is led by women, for example? Like, I wanted to actually, Noelani, if you can focus on the sovereignty movement, right? Because we all know that during the the annexation, or against annexation in 1998, a lot of women were really at the forefront to struggle, right? So how do you kind of talk about that in terms of their impact and, and how they really just change the nature of the internal dynamics of movements.
Yeah, I think actually the way I want to address the question is to acknowledge two amazing women who are here in the room who have been part of movements that allowed us to have the sovereignty movement.
In the first place.
In terms of their role in protecting Kaʻōpua in the 1970s. And so that's Auntie Loretta Reedy and Auntie Mahealani McFarlane. I was really fortunate to get to hear just some of the stories that they shared about that time, what it was like to be working with other women to organize and support, their families. So it wasn't just, I think it would be sort of wrong to characterize it as being led by women, but that, women played a very pivotal role alongside Kane, but the Kane are the ones typically who are remembered, and so it was really exciting for me to get to hear some of their stories. And I always thought, so many people know the Kaho'olawe 9, the first 9 that landed on him. But I always thought it was really amazing that Uncle Walter went home after that first visit, and he didn't go like, yeah, I'm gonna go rally my boys and we're gonna go back to the island. He went and he took his wife and his sister. So what does that say to you about the way, one, that he valued the women in his life, but also that, he understood that in this, and I would love if you want to say more about that, Auntie Loretta, I'd love to have, you address it. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just always thought that was such an amazing thing that he said, okay, I need to absolutely go back to this place. This island is dying. We need to protect it from the U.S. Navy continuing to destroy it. And so I'm going to go home and I'm going to bring my wife and my sister.
Actually, he came home feeling that way. And so Scarlett is his sister, and Scarlett, just think of the name, Scarlett. I want to go. And so I said, you're going to go, I'm going to go too. I really wanted to know how Kaʻōpua had changed my He was sent. He said, I have to go back. She's calling me and telling me she's dying. I felt that I needed to be there for my husband, also to go there. So now it's fine.
Yeah. Claro, claro.
Yeah. One thing when it comes to females, one of the most powerful group in PKO were our kupuna. Auntie Mary Lee, Auntie Claire Koo, Auntie Lenny Kapuni, Auntie Emma DeFries, Auntie Rose Wainui, and Auntie Harriet. Without those women, they spent the night on the sands at McKenna Beach with us. They made Walter and George and Rich and Emmett. They made them sleep next to the kupuna said, you folks are gonna go sleep over here, right next to us. Zenny Sawyer made the kupuna bags it was their eke. They brought all their stuff whenever we were gonna go to the island or try and get on the island, which usually end up in tribes because we were either the boats couldn't go because the Coast Guard was stopping, whatever it was. But without the kupuna, it would have been Absolutely, formal constituents. Because the females, we had a few climbing husbands, but it was those females that was anti-clerical with their game. Come on, you fella! You folks, come on! Even when we were at the courts, they were right there. In fact, Anticlara was carrying her cane when George Helm is singing, when Emily, after George is Paul singing and Emily's talking, Anticlara is right next to him with her cane. I mean, the females in PKO were just, and we were all young and we were led. Without them.
Actually, good. Actually, that's what I wanted to ask based on your experiences or your knowledge or ideas about women's movements, because the way in the Philippines, we've had a very robust, like very, very radical women's movements and like especially communist parties, which are, illegal organization. It's revolutionary, organization. So they're not in the mainstream in terms of the protests and mostly underground movements. And in fact, that's what I was really interested when I first studied women, is about women who were part of the Communist Party, right? And in the Philippines, especially for women, I have to ask them in terms of ideology, why were you part of these movements in the first place? And I would ask them, are you a communist or were you a communist, and how do you understand communism, right? And of course, for the women, I mean, all the leaders of the communist movements in the Philippines were all men, Probably there's a few women who eventually became part of the leadership, but they were always so reluctant to talk about, communism, because of this, there's still this kind of stigma about, what a communist is or a communist movement. And there's always this idea that, women don't really understand, communism ideologically. They go to these movements because they join their men in the movement. They're usually, they're usually the sisters, the lovers, or, the cousins of the men, and they join, right? And they're there for self-protection because they want to protect them, especially during the war. They want to protect themselves against the Japanese. They're not really there to advocate for communism. But then you realize that they actually were risking their lives. They actually became communists, and they have an understanding of communism. Maybe not the way that ideologically we would understand it, but it was very clear that they were willing to die for the movement, right? Just like the men. And I'm just kind of thinking about, in terms of the challenges of these women. When I looked at my own research, I mean, those women were not only were they marginalized in the movement. Most of the women were doing all the cooking and the washing and then all that, right? So there's still this kind of domestic and domestic role for the women, even if they're revolutionaries, right? And then not only that, there was just so much like sex opportunism in the movement. A lot of these women who joined the communist movement were young, women, single, and then you have all these married men who were part of the movement who then took, I mean, it's all consensual, because in the revolutionary movement, the Communist Party, rape is, if you rape somebody, the punishment for that was death, So it was all consensual, but then there's all this kind of, there was this, consensual in the sense that there's this power differential, like the men are in power and the women were there, and so there are all these different challenges of the women, that in terms of the history of women in this, especially revolutionary movements, right? In terms of leadership, in terms of their roles, marginalization, in terms of sex opportunism, and then the fact that most of these women, when they get pregnant, they have to leave the movement and all that. So I'm just thinking about what you guys think about, about the challenges that these women face, like in terms of your own experience, whether in the Hawaii movement, because we all know how amazing these women, but I'm sure that they all had all these different challenges, sexism, I mean, all these patriarchal attitudes, even though it is a matriarchal society, as we know, matriarchal power, but there are still all these patriarchal attitudes of men, even though they're in this very progressive and radical movements, right? They still think that women should do the cooking, women should do the, washing, I mean, all these things, right? And women cannot be elevated to. So I wonder whether, I mean, this is in terms of the Philippine but what do you guys think in terms of your experience?
No, their cultural context, and the cultural context of Guam is very different. Right. So we can't, it's not, those experiences and attitudes exist, but they're not universal.
Yes, of course.
Right,
yeah.
right. So it's, maybe you can speak to that more.
Yeah, I've been happy and lucky to be a part of a lot of different groups. When I'm with Women's Voices, Women Speak, the difference is palpable. I think historically and now, maybe all women involved in organizing know how it feels to be treated as the de facto secretary, like assumption that you will take the notes, you will send the emails, you will do all these things. And like you said, you think like, oh, we're in this group where everyone seems to have really great politics, but that stuff still happens. So I'll take this as an occasion, like all the men in the room, like think like, if you're involved in organizing spaces, maybe see if like if you've ever carried those kind of assumptions into an organizing space, or if you feel like you always feel like comfortable having your voice heard, or like to invite other people in the group to speak, maybe if they haven't spoken. So I invite everyone to think about that and do that, and not just in organizing spaces, right, but just in general. So I think there's like that just like immediate challenge of just like doing organizing and stuff. But then one thing I was thinking about when you said what characterizes the movement is that I wish I kind of addressed more in my initial remarks is I feel like I kind of presented all the ways like, oh, the work is really heavy, it really weighs on you. But something that really stood out to me from going on this huaka'i and stuff was just how much the kind of kupuna and despite doing like just staring like the most insidious, horrifying realities of our world like right in the face every day. I remember actually on our first day, like our first full day in the Philippines, we were in Olongapo. It was already a long journey just to get to Manila, and then it was a long journey from Manila to Olongapo. I personally was exhausted. I looked around, like everyone around my age looked pretty exhausted, but all the kupuna were seriously partying. They were dancing, and I was just like, just like bracing myself against the wall. I was like, we can't be the most tired people here right now. And Ihi was like, have you noticed all the kupuna got really great skin for their age? And I was like, yeah, it's centering like that kind of joy in being with one another, because they all live in Okinawa, the U.S., Korea, Guåhan. They live all over the place. When they gather, they have so much joy and love for one another. And they showed a slideshow from the very first network gathering in 1997 all the way to the present, and just to see all of them then, like 30, like I just keep saying 30 years ago because math is hard. 30 years ago to now, and seeing them in a different stage, and they're still so joyful to do this work because it's that relationship which sustains them. And even on the online meetings, every online meeting ends with a song and dance too, which is sometimes it's hard to get up the energy to do it over Zoom. So I think I've never had a song and dance in any other organizing space I've ever been in. So that's something that really sticks out. So I don't want people's perception of the network to be like, oh God, it's a bummer, because all this stuff is a huge bummer. But they really center joy in the work in a way that really inspires me. And I think just in terms of the challenges, this kind of goes back to what Noelani brought up just about like how history is memorialized, and how it always skews towards like a kind of male-oriented narration of history. I think something that this is something that came up when I was talking to Nikki, during the huaka'i, because Nikki is the principal investigator for missing and murdered Native Hawaiian women, girls, and mahu. And so what she was really taken by was how Okinawan women have very meticulously documented every instance of sexual violence by U.S. service people against Okinawan women since 1945. There's a member of their hui who has literally gone through every single page of every single newspaper to find cases. They do oral histories, they take down testimony, they find these as, they have all these different ways that they seek out ways to support the survivors. And so Nikki brought up this term of like data sovereignty, and how like, these obscured histories, they had to take it into their own hands. And I recently got a copy of their latest edition. They're on the 13th edition of this U.S. Sexual Crimes Chronology. That's the English title. And I think, when I've talked about this before, people have asked me, well, how many entries are in there? And I feel like it's really not about how many entries are in there. It's about they're on the 13th edition. They've been doing this for 30 years, and they're working on 14th edition already, even though the 13th edition was just finished. And so I think like that's been a big challenge for them. They've had to just take this work into their own hands, and I think that so yeah, I was thinking alongside with Nikki about like, what would that look like in her efforts with missing and murdered Native Hawaiian women's, girls, and mahu, and stuff, and how, the larger structures of power tend to just not give a crap about, the effects of militarism on women, girls, and so how that just becomes another thing that we have to take upon ourselves because we care about that story. Yeah. Oh yeah, please. Yes.
So we actually have at HPJ we have interns, and two of our interns, one is Malia and Yeshua, and a boy, and a male identified, right, are looking into the instances of violence every time RIMPAC arrives in Hawaii. So they are meticulously going through, and they're taking this as the blueprint. They started in 1971, and they're going through every newspaper, every police report, anything that's happening in the summers that the military's here, and there's periods where it's like when the military's here during RIMPAC, it jumps up, 50%, the crimes in general, like, because they're getting into bar fights along, and like in the middle of that, there's these assaults and other things that are, and that's just what they can kind of find. The only year that they didn't find an increase in crime so far was 2020 when they didn't land. So that says so much. The heights, of course, are like, when Reagan's in power and these different moments, and they're like, but we need to find more data, and they're realizing that they have to do it that way. The great thing about Okinawa was like the newspaper and the government and everybody, they're like they all want the US military out, right? And so when there's like the support there for them to be able to create that 14th edition. But the model that set, inspiring someone who's 18 and 19, both a woman, both female and male, identify, female and male identify, I take that back, Malia is that. But like these, for all gender, this generation is saying we need to do that. That they are now the collectors of data, that they are the researchers, and that they're at the core of the campaign leading through their research. And I think that's the major shift that we're seeing now, is that when we think about that model of just bringing everybody together, it's like we are the center of our organizing, our data, and our revolutionary change, right? So then when we think about Wahine that way, it's that Wahine that's doing all that data that's never going to be, they're not going to get the poster, right? And that's been true for every single movement. It's always we know exactly who did all the work for every movement everywhere. We know this, right? And we know who got the poster and got the TV ads, and we know, right? And it's always an amazing thing when there are women voices that rise up. That's like exceptional in a Western context.
Yeah.
In a Western context. But it is not exceptional in a Hawaiian context. It's not exceptional in a Guåhan context. It's not exceptional in all these other, actually even in an Okinawan context. And you know, so it's how do you undo empire by at least letting those names rise up, you know? So it's in us also saying, you know, like in me saying, Malia is actually doing this work. And always naming that she's doing that work and that they're doing that work. And for us to always interrupt the narrative of who's actually doing the work of resistance, right? So I mean, just to play off of that, because I think it's so important.
I wanted to follow on that because earlier in another panel, someone was talking about the power of story and how by retelling these stories, right, we can change the narrative, historical narratives. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of my recollections of the Mauna, because I feel like Wahine and Mahu leadership was so crucial on the Mauna for so many reasons in 2019. So for those who weren't there, and sorry if I'm retelling stories that you folks know, but it's good to retell stories even if you've heard them. But so construction was supposed to begin on July 15, 2019. There were some people that laid down on the cattle guard, and then the kupuna, after that happened, decided, okay, we're gonna start this line. And so they set the line on the, what we now call Alahulu Kupuna, the Mauna Kea Access Road. And they held that line for the next couple of days. And then the law enforcement, which, you know, the settler state had brought in multiple different law enforcement agencies, just a hyper-patriarchal display of settler state police power, riot gear, sound cannon. So on the morning of January 17th, they began to arrest kupuna, but slowly, sort of one at a time. And then there were lots of folks, but Wahine particularly, who were kind of gathering behind the kupuna tent. And after about 3 hours of this one by one, you know, carrying kupuna to the police wagon, one of the lead officers came up to the kupuna line and they said, you know, we're getting tired of this going slow. We're gonna come harder, we're gonna come faster, we're gonna come with more force. And as soon as they said that, all of these wahine who had been gathering behind the tent immediately moved in front of the tent and formed lines. First 2 lines, then 3 lines, then 4 lines, then there was like 100 wahine, all locked arm in arm. And the kane then came and sat down behind the wahine and between the wahine and the kupuna. And we stood there for, I don't know, it felt like hours. I don't know how long it was, but it felt like hours. And it seemed like an endless just line of police, law enforcement coming in. Many of them had no name tags. They were wearing sunglasses, not wanting to look at us, like close enough where we could almost feel them breathing, but also not making any sort of eye contact. And the tension just got so high in that moment. There were lots of really cool things happen. Like I remember Haoli started to do a poem where she was talking about our history, right? Other women speaking up. And then all of a sudden from the sidelines of people who were not locked arm in arm, someone said, there's Mahu leading a motorcade in Honolulu and they shut down the H1 freeway. And all of us were like, Mana Mahu, yes! And one of the leaders of that motorcade was Hinale Moana Wang. And a few months later when I can't remember, it was like the Kukia'i Mauna Unity March, Kukahi Unity March or something like that, happened. I believe it was the largest march that's ever taken place in Honolulu through Waikiki. Right at the front of that march were these big banners that said Mana Mahu. And I think it was so important in that moment in 2019 because it was exactly 200 years since the Aikapu, the breaking of our kapu state religion sort of system, that this reassertion of Kanaka jurisdiction on the Mauna and elsewhere, whether it was on H1 or the Lahaina wharfs, was really recognizing and not just recognizing, but that Mana Wahine and Mana Mahu were coming to the forefront of those movements in the assertion of Kanaka jurisdiction in those times was absolutely critical to why we were so successful, I think. And that's not to say that there wasn't, misogyny and homophobia and lateral violence going on within the movement. Like, that's not to say that those things didn't exist, and it's important internally, I think, for us to deal with those things. But I do think it's really critical for us to, as we remember these stories, now we're like 5 years, it's hard for me to imagine, we're 5 years from that time, right? We're 5 years from that. And even though for those of us who were there, that memory still feels so like palpable, like immediately we can call it up in our bodies. Soon we're gonna be talking to children who were not born when that happened, very sooner than we think. So we have to be telling those stories, and we have to be remembering the centrality of Wahine and Mahu in the leadership of those movements, and making sure that we say their names.
You remember the hula that Auntie Loretta did that first day? Right, so after they're being tied down to the cattle guard, and it's this exhausting day. And then they were gonna they were gonna put up a gate or something down.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like being on high alert again. And then at the end of that day, just to calm everyone down, Auntie Loretta did a hula for us. And it was like, there was no cameras, there's no media there. Like, this is like literally like day one, day two. And that is the moment on the Mauna that I thought was the most precious. When there were no cameras, and honestly, that wasn't the height of the misogyny. All the other drama came when it became known after the arrest, but before that, it was pure aloha. And when things got heated, it was Wahine that put their hands, particularly on the Kane that were losing their mom. They get upset. They put their hands, and Auntie Pua case. They began singing, right?
Aloha.
Yeah.
And it was that song. So we were just talking in the last panel about art and the role of art in our movements, how central it is. If it was not for that singing and for that hula and for that calming and the poetry that, whatever that was happening even on the cattle guard and all the things, that it wasn't on any of the cameras, that's what really helped us there. Right? It wasn't it wasn't all the other things. It was that at the core of it. And that was what you named it.
And the ongoing care, the person coordinating the whole kitchen, the coordinators of Kanaka Costco, the coordinators of the tent that received all the donations, all Wahine. Those were all Wahine.
And the media team.
And the media team. So, I mean.
Yeah, and the Moderator.
So we should just have all Wahine movements. The problem starts when we try to put men and women together in these movements. No, I'm kidding. But what's so nice. It's so empowering are the like what the experiences you shared about this kind of solidarity with women in the Philippines and Okinawa and Hawaii, and coming together in to understand and to learn from each other, right? I mean, I think this is really the future, hopefully, of the movement. But yeah, so I think we don't. Do we have? I think it's already 5 o'clock. I'm sorry, but it's been wonderful. Thank you so much.